Amen. So let's come home to Pennsylvania. And Jeff, we'll start on your side with this. What are you thinking is the biggest obstacle for our Republican candidate going against Robert Casey Jr., other than incumbency?
Enthusiasm. I mean, our folks really have to turn out. One of the things that really impressed me in 2016, and you could sense it. I mean, this was the great disparity between living here and being here every day, and then tootling off to New York or Washington to be on CNN. And I'll tell you a little anecdote here. The weekend of Halloween in 2016 was Saturday. I didn't have to be on television, so I said to my then 97-year-old mom, "Mom, we're going to go get a pumpkin." So I plopped her in the car, and we went down Route 15 to, I guess it's the Weiser farm stand, to get a pumpkin. Well, as we're driving along, I began to notice a very interesting thing. Somebody had hand-painted Trump's name on the side of a barn. There were signs everywhere. And it so caught my attention that I started to count. I lost count, finally. I did count one Hillary sign. So shift ahead to Monday. Now I'm in New York on the set with Anderson Cooper and my CNN pals, and I tell this story. And immediately my liberal friend said, "Jeff, the data, the data, the data." And I said, "I'm just telling you, when you see that much enthusiasm in Pennsylvania for candidate for President of the United States, something is happening out there." And a few days later, of course, it did. So there's the message right there, is that we have got to have that enthusiasm to get out there for Scott, for whoever's our Senate nominee, for all of our candidates up and down the ballot.
I had a similar experience. I'm a geologist, amateur geologist. I'm rock hunting in York County. And there are Trump signs everywhere. I counted 3 Hillary signs, but one of them was Hillary for president. That's a true story. So Joe, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth is a great Commonwealth. I would agree with what Jeff said. Certainly with regards to the elites and Northeastern elites, the president is not very popular, but if you come to the heartland of the country, he's extremely popular, and that'll probably tell the tale with a lot of these House seats. In the state of Pennsylvania, with regards to the U.S. Senate race, Bob Casey starts off with incumbency and with a family name that's got a lot of history, and he won, I think, the last race by a record number of votes. So he's got strong roots in Pennsylvania, but I think there's a lot of momentum. I certainly when you leave Philadelphia area and you come to where the rest of our great Commonwealth is, there's tremendous enthusiasm for the president, and I think a candidate who's able to capture some of that enthusiasm, somebody who stands for Pennsylvania values, who has Pennsylvania history, right, and is able to capture the excitement of Pennsylvania voters, can get folks to come out and vote. Now, here's the challenge. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we've got nearly 1 million, or maybe about 1 million more Democrats voting than Republicans. So we start off at a disadvantage, but of course we all know that not 100% of the people come out to vote on election day. So if our folks show up on election day, we have a really good chance to elect a Republican to the U.S. Senate. I say that as somebody who's been in this business for a long time. I worked for a U.S. Senator named Dan Quayle. Some of you may remember Dan Quayle, great U.S. Senator from Indiana. I was his spelling coach. And Dan, great man, great conservative. His son actually served a term in the U.S. House in Arizona, from Arizona. And then I worked in the White House for President George Bush. And then my oldest daughter worked in the White House, worked at the Republican National Committee, and then worked in the White House for George W. Bush, worked on his re-election campaign, and then more recently worked for the RNC for Reince Priebus, and she was in charge of the northeastern part, all the northeastern states politically for the Republican National Committee. And so we look at these races very closely, and we look at them analytically, and there's a shot here in Pennsylvania. I mean, there's a really good chance in Pennsylvania for a Republican to win that U.S. Senate seat. So that's a great opportunity. But our folks have to come out and vote, and our candidates have to hit all the right buttons.
Are these same issues motivating the folks in Pennsylvania to do at a national level with President Trump?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's always very tricky. It's kind of like threading a needle. You've got to figure out how you can be your own person and at the same time be supportive of the president and the president's policies. There are some parts of the Commonwealth, I mean, southeastern Pennsylvania, I don't know what the most recent numbers are for the president in southeastern PA, but that's a part of the state that has a significant amount of votes. And so for any candidate, you've got to be careful about what you're saying. You've got to keep it, I think, your message Pennsylvania-centric in that part of the state and not have so much of a national message saying that I'm going to just support whatever the president says. You can get away with that, I think, maybe in the central part of the state and in the western part of the state and northern and northwestern parts, northeastern parts of the state. You can cling a little bit closer to the president, and that'll have a very positive effect. But in the southeastern part of the state, the last thing you want to do is you don't want to give a reason for Democrats to show up in big numbers. They're going to turn out anyway. But if you can get our people to show up where we are reliably Republican, and likewise get them to show up in the southeastern part of the state, you have a shot to win.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things that I talked about, I get a chance to appear on Fox, but I'm relegated to weekends, which is okay with me. And everybody was making a big deal over the special election out west. And I pointed out the 70,000 voter advantage that the Democrats had. And nobody really talked about that very much because they all assumed it's always been a Republican district. And while Rick Santorum came from there and John Hines came from there, the rep before this was a Democrat for some time, and I believe even between Santorum and Hines. So it's not an automatic Democrat district. So that they really are a Republican district. They really did have an advantage.
One of the problems that the national media has is understanding that this is known as the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, not the Commonwealth of Philadelphia.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you a quick story. The night before the 2016 election, CNN had moved its set to Washington on the top of a building here so that the White House is behind us. And I'm on with Anderson Cooper and my friends, my liberal friends, and we stopped because Hillary Clinton is doing a rally, as some of you may remember, in Philadelphia in front of Independence Hall, preceded by Bruce Springsteen and John Bon Jovi. And then it was Bill Clinton and Chelsea Clinton and Michelle Obama, and then lastly President Obama, and then very lastly Hillary Clinton. Well, my friends could not contain themselves, and they said, "This is just wonderful." My friend Van Jones says, "This is just fabulous. The first black president is going to give way and hand the torch to the first woman president, et cetera." And Anderson finally looks at me and says, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, let me just put it to you this way. I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan. If I lived in the Philadelphia area, I could have gone to that concert. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to vote for him." And I said, "You need to understand Pennsylvania as a whole. And what you're looking at here, you guys are thinking this is all terrific." I said, "But what you're really seeing," I said, I can hear the voices in the middle of central Pennsylvania this minute, that you've got a bunch of political insiders scratching each other's backs with a bunch of Hollywood rock and roll royalty, and they're making a big deal and think we're all on the same page." I said, "Trust me, seeing something like this is going to energize people where I live to get out and make sure it doesn't happen." And the next day, there you go.
All right. Well, we're going to move on to our candidate segments now, and we will have 20 minutes with each of them. First, please welcome Congressman Lou Barletta.
Thank you.
All right, Jeff, it's all yours.
All right, Congressman.
Good to be here. Thank
I
you.
want to start with something different here. I looked this up today. There have been 57 United States senators from Pennsylvania. 57 if you count Simon Cameron twice, because he served before the Civil War, left, and then came back and served again. That's from 1789 all the way through to Pat Toomey and Bob Casey today. Of those 57, which one or ones do you admire the most and see as a role model for you if you are elected?
Well, I had a personal relationship with Rick Santorum, actually. I probably wouldn't have been here today if it was not for Rick. I was mayor of Hazleton, and it was only my second year as mayor of Hazleton, and I remember one day going to a political event. My wife said, Senator Santorum's on the phone. It's one of those moments that you remember everything. It was about 6 o'clock. I was going to Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and he said, I'd like you to think about running for Congress. After I nearly fell on the bed, I went and told my wife, and it was really Rick Santorum that began to give me some focus that I could do more than just being mayor of Hazleton. So we share a good relationship, a great relationship today, and I would have to say Rick Santorum.
Yeah. Well, what do you, I know that Senator Casey will certainly be able to raise lots of money, and I know that whoever our nominee is for the U.S. Senate will be challenged to raise lots and lots of money. What do you think, in a perfect world, if you're the nominee for the Republican Party for the U.S. Senate, what do you think will be the key issue, if you could rate one as a key issue in the election for the fall seat?
I think the biggest issue for me is the contrast between Senator Casey and his record and myself and my record. You know, I was a businessman before I ever got into politics in the real world. My wife and I started a business on $29.95, and we grew that business into the 6th largest in the country. You learn a lot about government and regulations when you're doing something like that. In fact, I tell this story that it was the beginning of me looking at government. For $29.95, you get a case of aerosol cans and this little machine to put it in. And, I didn't even know if it was legal what we were doing, so I told my wife, we need a real machine. And I walked into a local bank as a young man and with just an idea. I just had an idea, and I walked out with a $2,500 line of credit. That would not happen today. Because of regulations, you can't walk in with a good idea and walk out with a line of credit. We were able to grow a big business because of that, and we've stopped that. We've taken away the entrepreneurial spirit of this country with over-regulations. Then I go and I become mayor of Hazleton, and I'm faced with an issue that I never dreamt I would be faced with, the problem of illegal immigration. And nobody wanted to help. I literally stood there by myself, went to Washington, asked for help, met with the Department of Justice. It was in 2005. They were great. They brought all these experts in to talk to me. I talked about the gangs that had moved into Hazleton, the children that were being recruited at 9 and 10 years old. I talked about the illegal immigration problem. Our population grew by 50%, but our tax revenue stayed the same. It became impossible for me to provide services. We've had violent crimes happening, and I needed help. And they were great. At the end of the day, they gave me this nice coffee mug. They gave me a lapel pin, and pat on the back, and I left there so disappointed, realizing that Washington, who created this problem, by not facing up to the fact that we had an issue that mayors like myself had to deal with, Washington was broke. And you know, so you know, for me, I think the contrast that I've stood up every time I've had to stand up and fight for the people I represent. And you know, as I travel around the state, the thing that I hear the most is people tell me that they don't know what Bob Casey has done. They can't think of anything that he's done. And you know, I sort of agreed because I had a hard time, but I disagree. I actually liked him better when he was doing nothing.
Well,
you know, he has done something. He's given us Obamacare. He's voted to not to let you have more of your money. He's voted against the tax cuts. He's voted to support sanctuary cities, and that's not who Pennsylvania is. So I'm going to be happy to show the contrast between somebody who stood up for the people they represent and Senator Casey's record.
I thought he was a little like Punxsutawney Phil, except he only comes out every 5 years, okay? Because he really has hid from the voters for the most part. You'd see him here and there, but you don't see Senator Casey very often.
And RJ, if I could just say, that's a big point in this campaign. I do what I call Main Street tours. I was a mayor, and then in my congressional district, I go into each community and meet with the elected officials. Then I go downtown and I meet the business owners, and I go to the volunteer firefighters to thank them. Pennsylvania, 94% of our firefighters in Pennsylvania are volunteers. And then I get to know what's going on in that community. I did over 40 of them in my congressional district. I did one yesterday in Conshohocken. And the other thing I hear is people don't see Senator Casey in their communities. They haven't seen him and really learn what's going on. And I think that's what people in Pennsylvania want. They want somebody who's going to go into their community, learn what their issues are, and bring that back to Washington, and then fight for them. Listen, anybody can put your name on a bill. I can do that every single day. When the people in my district were flooded with Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricane Irene, I put my butt in a boat and delivered water to people. There's a difference between putting your name on a bill and actually rolling up your sleeves and fighting for people.
I want to go back to regulation for just a second. Whether it's at a federal level or locally, I was with some lawmakers yesterday, state lawmakers, talk about regulation a lot. I was with a car dealer today. They were supposed to have a new dealership open now. Then they thought it was going to be the fall. Now it's going to be next spring. Now this is a state issue. His comment was, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania wants us to fix all the roads in the state. They want them to redo all around the dealership where they did. Now they want a quarter mile away, including an exit from one of the main thoroughfares. This is a car dealer, a quarter mile away. Okay, how do you get ahead of that? I understand that the president can do certain things, but how do you fight that, given that they're so entrenched with all this regulation?
Well, first of all, the president's, his goal was for every new regulation that we impose that we reduce two. And I think last we checked, he did a little bit better than that. It was almost 20-some regulations have been repealed and rolled back for every new regulation. And I think that's why we're seeing the stock market doing what it was doing, and because it was the optimism, that Washington was going to roll back, and we want reasonable regulations. Nobody is talking about no regulations, but that's really what has been heard, and that's the difference between the Obama policies that Senator Bob Casey supports: more regulations, bigger government, more spending, and I'm going to talk about spending too, and Republicans really need to step it up here and get control of that as well, because these omnibuses that we are forced to vote on is really very disgusting as someone like myself who had to have a balanced budget as a mayor, and everyone here watching, they have to balance their budgets at home. But we need to rein in Washington regulations, and we're going to see the economy go. If we can get infrastructure done, which is going to grow the economy, because when we're doing infrastructure, people will make good money, and they'll spend that right in the local economy. It's going to grow the economy more. So we have to do a combination of reducing spending. I support a balanced budget amendment, and actually I wish we could have zero balanced budgeting, but roll back some regulations, and the tax cuts are going to really get the economy going.
Jeff.
In talking with a lot of conservatives over time, one of the things I hear repeatedly, it's conservatives who are seriously unhappy with the Republican Congress. If you were elected to the Senate, what would you do to get them on the ball? I mean, I hear this refrain constantly, and I worry about it because, as we talked about earlier about enthusiasm, if you've got people on our side who think that it doesn't make any difference to elect somebody, they're not going to show up.
That's the reason I want to go to the Senate, because I've sat in the House where we passed bills. For example, we passed all 12 appropriation bills the way we should,
Right.
And send it over to the Senate where they don't have the votes, they don't have the 60 votes to be able to pass it, and that's how we get these giant omnibus spending bills, because the Senate just simply is not, with the Democrats just being an obstructionist and voting no against everything, we can't get these bills through. That being said, let me tell you, I'm also not happy on our side as well. I voted 61 times to do something to Obamacare. Repeal it, replace it, anything with an R that I could find. But shouldn't we have had something to replace it with? I mean,
I don't understand, for the life of me, why, after 7 years of this, they were not ready the day after President Trump was inaugurated to stand on the Capitol step and say, here it is.
exactly right. And I think that's where the frustration where the frustration comes is that, you know, it just didn't make sense. I mean, we should have had something ready. We had 6 years to do that, and the people have the right to be upset, and that's, you know, I'm not afraid to speak out about it because I think it's wrong. That's not what I went to Washington for. You know, I didn't go there to vote for a bill and have to choose between things I really, really at my heart, my principles, hate, and then think about putting our boys, our men and women, our sons and daughters in airplanes that aren't fit to fly, and our vets, and dealing with the opioid crisis, and having to make that decision. When we have, you know, a Republican House, Republican Senate, and the President in the White House, however, because of the rules of the Senate, without 60 votes, we're not getting those things done.
Joe?
Yeah, well, you're right on point. Most Republicans and most conservatives think that it's lessening regulation is a good thing. That if you free up people who are in business, who own their own businesses, as I once did, to succeed, that, you know, that's a good thing, and that people ought not be held back by regulation. So I think that you make a point that's well regarded. I think many Republicans, I agree with Jeff that many Republicans and many conservatives are concerned about spending being out of control in Washington, D.C. And, you know, we send Republicans to Congress to be fiscally responsible. And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction among Republicans, among Americans, I think, with regards to the lack of at least demonstration of continued fiscal responsibility in practice over the last cycle. Let me shift the conversation to something more philosophical. Term limits. It's something that it's. I don't think it's ever going to come to a vote. I don't think that it's ever going to be an issue that Congress votes on. But at the same time, it's helpful to know where members stand on the issue of limiting the number of terms that members serve. Once upon a time in America, we had citizen legislators who left their jobs, left home, and took a sacrifice to work in Washington, D.C. to serve the people that were kind enough to elect them. And then the understanding was they do that for a while and then turn around and come back home. And right now we have, I think, maybe about 36 at last count, members of the House and the Senate who have said that they support the idea of some kind of an amendment that would limit the number of terms that members could serve in both the House and the Senate. And then there are others that say as well, you know what, at the end of the day, the voters are the ultimate term limiters. The voters are the ones that limit terms, because if somebody's doing a good job, they might want them to stick around. If somebody's not particularly helpful in this role, that the voters have the right to send them home, to bring them back home. So tell me where you stand on that.
So I'm not only going to talk the talk, I walk the walk. When I went to Washington, I said I believe in term limits, and I was going to term limit myself to 10 years in the House, and I believe 10 to 12 years is enough for a House member to serve. And I also believe that 12 years in the Senate is enough, and because I believe that, I believe Bob Casey's 12 years are up. So I was just the mayor of a small town. I was, the youngest of 4 boys. God rest my father's soul. I'm sure he's looking down thinking he's the last one of my 4 boys that I would ever believe would be doing this. And I have to admit, when I went to Washington and for the first time and walked through the halls of Congress and looked at the statues of people that I studied in history, for the first 6 months I was there, I walked around thinking, how did I get here? How did I get here? How did somebody like me ever get here? The second 6 months I walked around thinking, how did they get here?
Lou, you mentioned the 60 votes in the Senate. Where do you stand on the nuclear option, as it's called?
Well, it's so tempting when you have the ball, right?
Right.
I mean, it's so tempting. However, I have to tell you, I have nightmares thinking of what would happen to America and to the next generation if they have the football. I mean, let's face it, our policies are not going to destroy what we believe, America stands for. But can you imagine Schumer and the Democrats being able to pass everything that they want just because of a simple majority? I don't know if we could turn that back. I honestly believe that Donald Trump came just at the right time in American history, because I do believe that if 4 more years of the policies, I don't know if we could have fixed it. I really don't. I believe our country was at a crossroads at that time. So I gotta be honest with you, RJ, I'm sort of afraid of that because of what they could do, not because what we would do.
Jeff?
Should Scott Pruitt be fired?
You know, that's you know, again, that's you know, being a mayor, you know, there's a lot of internal information that you have and other people don't have, and you see things, you know, the way that maybe everyone else doesn't see it on the outside. So I don't like to, you know, make those opinions choices when I may not have all the same information that everybody else does. And you know, it's great to be able to come out and tell people that. But to be honest with you, that's a personnel issue that I'm sure the president has more information than I do. So I'm going to trust their. You know, you know, we all know through The Apprentice, he fires people.
Yes, he does.
So, you know,
By Twitter.
If he needs to be fired, you know, this president's an executive, and that's one thing that he's good at is knowing, you know, knowing what people need to do and what they aren't doing. So I'm gonna trust his opinion and his decision.
I want to suggest the president's ahead of his time because there was a poll out this week that showed that 84% of millennials would rather get a text or a tweet that they're fired than hear from the boss. So,
That's great. That's great. That's great. This is a hard question, but I'm sure this is going to be one of the big challenging questions that you'll face if you're the nominee in a debate in the fall with Senator Casey, and it has to do with the whole issue of what we do about these shootings in schools. Republicans always tend to be on the side of Second Amendment, where we tend to be strong Second Amendment people, and Democrats tend to be maybe not as forceful on that issue. There have been a whole host of responses to what, of course, everybody responded correctly by saying, you know, pray for the families, and I thought that the sympathetic response and the empathetic response was an appropriate response. But at the end of the day, you had close to 1 million young people that marched this past fall. They won't all vote, but they are energized at this point, and they're not all Democrats either. Actually, they're not all Democrats. They're not all of mine. I think for the most part, they just want to see the problem solved, and they haven't really heard any good responses. One of the responses has been initially to perhaps arm teachers, and there are some that say that teachers ought to be allowed to have guns. And one of my friends on MSNBC, who's a strong conservative, Rick Tyler, was saying that he at least thought that if a teacher was licensed to carry, that they ought to be allowed to have it. But then there's the larger issue of, you know, the first time a teacher, God forbid, who's licensed to carry, shoots a kid, either accidentally or the gun is stolen and somebody else shoots somebody else with the teacher's gun. You know, then that whole thing goes up in smoke. Do you see any kind of a solution to the challenge that children are asking for and that parents are asking for as well to that issue? And
before you ask, I just want to point out we have 1:30 left.
Okay.
As moderator,
I'll say
Loman
this.
told me I need to keep it iron
I'll say
fisted.
this as quickly as I can. If we're really talking about solving the problem of keeping kids safe, or if this is just about people who have a problem with the Second Amendment and those that want to defend the Second Amendment, I like to think of myself as a problem solver. I did it as mayor, and I did it in Congress. So, you know, no child should go to school being afraid to go to school, and no parent should ever wake up in the morning fearful that their son or daughter is not going to come home. You remember when somebody put a bomb in their shoe and went on a plane, and now we take our shoes off? You know, the next guy put a bomb in his underwear. You know, so it's that kind of theory. It's like bad people are going to think of something else. And so if we're really talking about keeping kids safe, I've asked for the administration, the president and administration, to add our schools as the 17th critical infrastructure in America. We have 16 sectors right now that we consider critical infrastructure: our nuclear power plants, our water systems, and that means something because the Department of Homeland Security comes in and assesses how we keep them safe. Our kids are our greatest asset, no different than our water and our power. I mean, our kids are our greatest asset. If we make that our critical infrastructure, if you cannot get into the school, it doesn't matter if it's a gun, you know, it doesn't matter if the next one wants to use a bomb, it doesn't matter if someone wants to use chemicals. Those kids, those children will be safe parents will know that when their kid is in that school, we don't have to talk about guns in relation to keeping our kids safe in schools, when we could make it a critical infrastructure and not let somebody get in that school with anything.
Congressman Lou Barletta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Next, we have our next candidate is State Representative Jim Christiana.
Gentlemen.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
All right, Jeff, we're going to start out with you this time.
The president is in the news. The president's always in the news. The president is in the news today on the issue of he's thinking about levying a $100 billion tariff on China. What are your thoughts on that? Pennsylvania has an interesting history with what is loosely called protectionism. With a number of our United States senators in history, going back, I spent some time, geek that I am, looking at this. There's a statue of Boys Penrose on the Capitol lawn, and he was one of the champion protectionists of all time. And I'll read you this quick little statement from my former boss, John Hines, who said at a Senate Finance Committee hearing in October 1989, quote, "It is simply not possible for a free enterprise, unsubsidized, unprotected American steel industry to compete and survive against subsidized and protected foreign competitors. It's as simple as that," unquote. What are your thoughts?
Well, my first thoughts are that tariffs, trade policy in general, these negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. Obviously, they're intertwined with diplomatic negotiations and specifically North Korea. And I think that the president deserves a tremendous amount of flexibility to negotiate these massive trade policies, economic policies. Any economic discussion with China has to include their assault on intellectual property. It has to address the fact that their intrusion into individual Americans' privacy. So I think the president deserves a lot of flexibility to negotiate these tariffs and trade policies. With that being said, this very quickly went from steel and aluminum to now dealing with soybeans, and there's a lot of farmers that are losing sleep because of this escalation. So I do think the president's flexibility is limited, but I think the president deserves a lot of flexibility. I also think that the president's unconventional approach is why he got elected, because the conventional approach wasn't working. And so I think we've got to allow the president ample time to try to deliver results that are in our best interest. And you know, if we go back to in my lifetime, the steel capital of the world went from Western Pennsylvania to the West Pacific. And 9,000 people used to work on J&L's site in Beaver County. In 1984, there was 0. And so a lot of that has been the result of economic policies, trade policies, and the rest of the world and China is not playing by the same rules. And if China wants to be an international leader, it's time that they act like it. And I think the president is finally standing up for America and American companies and American industries, and he deserves a lot of credit.
So I'm anxious, of course, to hear the eternal question about spending and about what will it take to ever get us to reduce the deficit, balance the budget. Give me your thoughts on how we get a Congress that's and a Senate that seems to be bent on runaway spending. How do we get them under control?
Well, the culture in Washington's broken. Everything is partisan, it's toxic, it's our team versus your team. And I don't think that culture is going to change with the people that have been there. The same cast of characters who've created these problems, I don't think give us a realistic opportunity to change them. So I think it does start with a cultural shift. How we changed the culture in the state capitol was the voters. They sent a tremendous amount of new people to Harrisburg. They took a shot on a 24, 25-year-old kid from Beaver County in a 2-to-1 Democratic district to send a message. And I think that's what it's going to take. You know, I support a balanced budget amendment. I think it's common sense. But we don't need that if people in Congress did their job, if they stopped spending money that they didn't have. I don't want to reduce the deficit, I want to eliminate it, because every dollar that they spend that they don't come in, my 2-year-old son and his generation are probably going to have to pay it back. And, you know, I think this is why this election, this primary election, is so important. And you have 3 candidates running for the Senate, myself, Congressman Barletta, Senator Casey. On average, we've all been given 10 years in the legislature. And the voters can look at our record and see who stood up to their own party when they wanted to overspend, who passed responsible budgets. Our records are what matter. The campaign rhetoric, we've all talked about these issues for decades. The sound bites are well known, but we need to start looking at our legislative records, and hopefully the voters will make their decision on that, and who gives us the best opportunity to expose Bob Casey's empty record, and then also who's going to go to the Senate. Work with anybody there, but who doesn't owe anybody anything. And I think this is a principled question. Do you think that Washington should spend money that it doesn't have? Or do you think it's okay to deficit spend? I don't think it's okay to spend money you don't have.
Where do you think Bob Casey is most vulnerable?
I think he's vulnerable on a few issues. I think Bob Casey has let down a tremendous amount of pro-life Democrats, independents, and Republicans. You know, if you're going to say that you support defunding Planned Parenthood and you're pro-life, then you better have a voting record to back it up. And unfortunately, throughout a primary process, you've got to differentiate yourself, talk about the issues in your voting record. And I think Congressman Barletta's recent vote and his vote to increase funding for Planned Parenthood is in a strong contrast to Bob Casey's. It's actually the exact same voting record. And I think that's going to give Republicans a difficult time to expose Bob Casey's fireable offense. And we need somebody who can actually debate him and take him on this issue.
I had a current member of Congress tell me that the first thing that leadership expects of you when you get to D.C. after being elected is your voting card and all your money. What do you think?
My leadership in Harrisburg, and if the voters of Pennsylvania send me to the Senate, the leadership in the Senate, they're not entitled to a single vote of mine. I think that if you look at this last omnibus spending bill, the fact we should talk about this, right? $1.3 trillion, $500 million to Planned Parenthood, fully funded sanctuary cities, Republican-led House and Senate. They dumped this bill on rank and file members 48 hours before the government's going to shut down. So you've got members who had to make the decision, do I shut down government or do I vote for this horrendous piece of public policy? There's absolutely no transparency, and it starts with the legislative leaders. Now, for the voters in Pennsylvania, the Republican voters should know that I wasn't recruited to run for this by Mitch McConnell. I don't owe the people in Washington anything. But I have a sense of urgency and a passion to start fixing these problems so that my kids and my grandkids someday don't have to inherit them. So they aren't getting my voting card. 13 million Pennsylvanians will have that, and that's the only people I'll owe if I get elected.
Jeff, should President Trump meet with Kim Jong-un? Should the president be meeting with Kim Jong-un from North Korea?
This goes back to my point about the president's unconventional approach. He burned the old playbook, and I think that's productive. If the president and his advisors think that could be productive to stabilize North Korea and make our allies and ourselves more secure, then I think he should be given that flexibility. Who am I to tell the president who he can meet with and who he shouldn't meet with?
He wouldn't listen.
Exactly.
That's right.
So the president,
And then tweet that you're a knucklehead.
correct. I'm just waiting for the day that the president comes up with a nickname for me too, but I think the president gets to make that decision. He's the commander-in-chief, and I think sitting down and having a conversation, we need more of that in Washington, and diplomatically, we definitely don't need less. Not sitting down with North Korea surely hasn't made us more secure or our allies more secure. Right. So I give that to the president.
And obviously you feel the same way about Putin.
I do.
Yeah.
You know, I know recently they were talking about criticizing the president for calling Putin. I mean, the president, you know, as long as he calls me on May 16th and after the November election to congratulate me, then we're fine. But the media will look for anything to take a shot at this president. I mean, as far as Russia's concerned, Putin is a gangster. I mean, that's not an opinion. I think that's almost a fact. And if we really want to punish Russia, let's make Pennsylvania a natural gas powerhouse. We have the natural gas. We can obviously get the economic benefits of developing natural gas, but think about the national security benefit of our allies being able to tell Putin to go pound sand that they don't need his natural gas. That'll really send a message to Russia.
So tell me, in a perfect world for you, you end up being the Republican nominee for the United States Senate, and then you're face-to-face with Bob Casey in a fall debate. What do you say to him when the questioners ask you about the 900,000 kids that marched having to do with school safety and what's the best solution? You're somebody that has young kids, so obviously it's an issue that you care about. But what is your response, and how does your response perhaps differ from the response of Bob Casey or even Lou Barletta?
Well, I think for me to be face-to-face with Bob Casey in the debate, we better be sitting down. He's substantially taller than I am. But I'll tell him on that stage, and I'll tell anybody that wants to listen that I think it's refreshing to see young people involved in public policy. And I think it's, yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that young people just went through probably the worst event of their life, and they're looking for solutions that I think is healthy. Now, with that being said, the solutions that they are presenting are not new solutions. And I think as they mature and they get older and they get involved in the process more, they will see that this is a century-old debate. That if we're going to secure our schools, it's not by Bob Casey just playing into the political opportunism of this movement. It's by actually making our schools safe. I want my kids' school to be as safe as where I go to work, as safe as where my wife goes to work. My wife works in an office building in downtown Pittsburgh. I work in the Capitol building here in Harrisburg. How do we secure those places? With security systems, with trained security officers, making sure that individuals who are coming into our school, into our office buildings, aren't armed to hurt us. We need a comprehensive solution to school safety. We do not need to further an old political debate. We need results. And the people in Washington, they seem to embrace this toxic environment when they really should be, reaching across going to the other side of the cafeteria and having a conversation. And it's not just the external threats we need to be focused on. It's the internal threats. In Pennsylvania, there is a violent incident in our public schools every 60 seconds. And you know what? One way I can tell Bob Casey, or I can go into every ward into Philadelphia and talk to those families, is because the public policy that I introduced, that Tom Corbett signed into law, was a school choice initiative. Candidates talk about school choice, but my record of school choice and my proposal that has been signed into law has saved 100,000 kids from failing violent schools by giving parents an option and a choice.
Now,
That's how we're going to make it better.
I was the chairman of a school choice PAC, as you may recall, and we funded candidates for the State House and the State Senate. Our political action committee did, who believe in school choice and the full menu of options to make our schools great. And so you deserve to be applauded on that. What do you respond when they ask you the question about should teachers be armed? Is that something that you think is viable, or do you think that that's a less viable option?
Well, I think it's not a comprehensive solution. I think it would give our students and our teachers a better feeling of security. But I don't think we should exclusively rely on that, actually. I mean, my office, the Capitol building, is not necessarily secure because I carry a gun or my wife when she goes into work. It's because we have a comprehensive security solution. And if we go back to after 9/11, and we talked about security, within no time, our airports were secure, our planes were secure, Democrats, Republicans worked together. There was a sense of urgency to never let that happen again. That's what we need for our schools, because there's nothing more valuable to secure than our kids. And they're vulnerable right now, and they're being exposed because of that vulnerability, and we've got to stop it.
One of the things that
Republicans perpetually have a problem with is the media. And I remember asking this question of Donald Trump in 2013, believe it or not, and I said, Republicans at the grassroots level are convinced that their national leadership, when they're attacked, they don't fight back. I said, what would you do? He said, oh, don't worry, I'll fight back. My question to you is, the moment, let's say you win this nomination, you are going to be demonized like you have never been demonized before. You're going to be the racist, homophobic, gun nut, I mean, on and on and on. So knowing that that's coming, what are your thoughts on how you will deal with that?
Well, the few things you need, I think, to be able to withstand a statewide race or a national race or any really election is you need to have thick skin, as they will say. But for me, you know, my inspiration comes from my wife. She's the reason I can do this. How I deal with that is an unbreakable commitment to God's plan, and I have a sense of urgency and a passion to make progress. We talk about solving a lot of these issues. My God, it'd be nice just for Washington to make some progress and to stop the problems from continuing to get worse. And so I have a passion. I also believe that term limits really help, and I'll tell you why. I imposed a term limit not when I was, 10 years on the job. I proposed a term limit from the very beginning when I was running for the legislature. I said, if I haven't solved these problems or made progress, then let somebody else do it. And they thought they had me. They said, oh, is that a term limit pledge? I said, you're darn right that's a term limit pledge. I honored that term limit pledge, but I'll tell you what that did. It created a sense of urgency in me to get things done, because I had a definite end, and I know what I wanted to do when I came into the legislature and how I wanted to leave it. And that's why I think term limits are refreshing, because they force elected officials to see that this is going to end and to get out.
How strongly do you believe that? Would you support an amendment to call for term limits for members of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, or is it something that you would just impose upon yourself? If you were elected, you would say that I'll only serve 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, or 12 years, or 3 terms in the U.S. Senate, or...
I take term limits any way we can get them. I don't think you need a constitutional amendment if legislators do the right thing, but oftentimes they don't do the right thing. And so I think, I know I would absolutely support an amendment to have those term limits. I think ultimately the voters get the benefit of throwing you out after 1 term, but I want to see term limits any way we can. And that's one of the reasons that I instituted a term limit pledge very early on, was to send a message to my colleagues. And I think you got to lead by example. I get asked all the time, what's the first decision you're going to make if you go to the Senate? It's going to be the same decision first decision I made when I went to the State House. I voluntarily posted my expenses on my website so that my office staff, myself, and my colleagues would know that I was going to be transparent. I didn't need to change the rules, I just had to lead by example. And I think that's what we need when it comes to term limits, posting expenses, so that the media doesn't have to send an investigative reporter to find out that millions of tax dollars have been used to settle sexual harassment claims. I'm a titan of transparency, because this is taxpayer money, and people deserve to be able to see it.
Jeff, I think we have time for 1 more.
We often hear, I'm sure Joe hears this on MSNBC, I heard it on CNN, you hear it in the media generally, that we are in the middle of a new civil war. Do you think that's the case here? And if so, as the United States Senator, what would you do to sort of get people to chill out?
I think that label is, it's unfortunate that someone would call that, after this country has seen what a civil war does to Americans and what it does to a country. I think it's a terrible label, first of all. I think there's a lot of bad labels right now, like calling, the family reunification program chain migration. I don't actually think that's meant to bring people together and solve the immigration problem. And so I don't think having a civil war label is appropriate. It might increase ratings, but it doesn't give me any hope of people working together. So one, I would reject that label. And two, what would I do to improve to reduce the toxicity in that building? It starts with having a conversation. Every piece of public policy I have gotten done, whether it was putting the budget online, whether it was the school choice legislation, whether it was the petrochemical plant that is putting 10,000 people to work in Beaver County, every time I've done it, it's been with a Democrat helping me along the way. It doesn't mean that I've watered down my principles. I am a proud conservative, and there are certain things that I won't compromise on. But there are a lot of things we could make progress on if we just started with a conversation. I worked with 2 African-American Democrats from Philadelphia to get my school choice bill done. Tony Payton and Tony Williams, 2 people that I don't see eye to eye on a lot of public policy. But what we did agree on was that the status quo was unacceptable. When I took on UPMC and the Highmark fight, which was going to leave 2 million Pennsylvanians without access to their doctor, without access to the hospitals that they built, I went to the most liberal member, Obamacare-loving member of the House of Representatives, and I said, you and I disagree on just about every piece of healthcare public policy, but we agree that our constituents shouldn't lose access, and we worked together and we focused on that. We didn't allow where we disagreed to derail progress, and guess what? We won. We now today have a budget that's online. We've got 10,000 people working in Beaver County on a site that was going to be vacant. And we've saved 100,000 kids from failing violent schools. To me, that is the recipe for getting things done in the legislature. And that's where I'll be starting, by having a conversation with my colleagues.
State Representative Jim Christiana.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Well, they are our 2 Republican candidates, and we are now going to have our Libertarian candidate come forward. We know that many Libertarians come to the PLC, so we're pleased to have Dale Kearns join us today.
Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you.
Hey, he has a cheering section. How about that? All right, I think we started with you, so Joe, it's all yours.
Yeah. So, well, Dale, welcome to the forum. Let me ask you a question that I've already asked the others. The philosophical question having to do with term limits. Even before we ask you about yourself, tell us a little bit about your philosophy with regards to whether or not elected members ought to serve as long as they might like, or whether or not they should be limited from a term standpoint.
Sure. I think most importantly, we always need to look at what's the root cause. Why are we asking this question? It's because we have legislatures we don't like. We have people in there that we don't like and we want to get rid of them, but we vote for them time and time again. The simple answer is do your homework, know who your legislators are, know where their money's coming from, don't vote for them. As for term limits, I think we can do something a little differently than just term limiting them. How about we get rid of their pensions? It's unethical for them to take pensions. They shouldn't even have them, you know? If we get rid of those pensions, they're not going to stay there. That's what they're there for, those pensions and moving up to the next level. That's how we do it.
Jorge Ramos, who is the famous Univision commentator and antagonist of President Trump and very pro-illegal immigration, revealed to Tucker Carlson the other night something that I thought was quite interesting. Jorge is an American citizen, a legal American citizen. Good for him. I think he lives in Florida somewhere. He votes in American presidential elections. He also revealed that, he's got dual citizenship, and he also votes in the Mexican presidential election. My question to you is, should we allow American citizens to have dual citizenship anywhere else?
Well, I think anybody should be able to be a citizen of where they'd like to be, as long as they're going by the
I mean, if you're an
proper
American
procedures.
citizen, do we get into the dual loyalty kind of situation here?
I personally don't have a problem with someone being a citizen of multiple countries. I don't see any downfall in that. Now, if you're someone who's a foreign entity and you're pumping money into the election, that's a completely different story. But for you to be a dual citizen of another country, I don't see a problem with that at all.
So if you're a Russian and an American and you campaign, you might be influencing our elections as a Russian.
exactly
I
right.
think that's what you're saying.
But with respect to the Russians, I mean, there have been manipulations in our elections for a long time. And nobody's talking about the fact that we have manipulations here. When you look at the DNC and what they did to Bernie Sanders, when you look at the RNC and how they changed the rules in 2012, and we have manipulations here within our own political parties where party members are selecting who's going to be the nominee rather than the voters. And that's something we need to really shed light on and get away from, because that's criminal.
Could you just give us a thumbnail, and then we'll go to Joe, on what you believe is the true difference as a libertarian between you and your two Republican counterparts?
I can't speak to both Republican counterparts, to be honest. I know a little bit more about Representative Barletta because he's someone who's been voting federally. The main difference, I'm principled. I believe that we have $21 trillion in debt and we need to do something about it. And there's no going this way and then coming back. It's end it now. Start cutting spending. Start getting rid of all the fat in the bills. Don't vote for an omnibus that funds Planned Parenthood and then a couple days later come out and say it's garbage. I mean, what is that? What kind of principles are they? We need to be principled. And with respect to the Second Amendment, don't sway. Just because the political climate's not there, stick to your principles. Tell them, the Second Amendment, we're not going to let you touch it. The Second Amendment isn't, it's hands off.
So, Congressman Barletta spoke very passionately as somebody who has been in business about the importance of decreasing regulation, that an environment that allows for almost runaway regulation strangles businesses and their ability to succeed, especially small businesses. And so we've seen a decrease in the recent months, of course, with this president in the number of regulations. Tell us how you feel about regulation. Do you feel that we are better to lessen regulation, or would you see a climate where we increase regulations, or are there specific regulation areas that you think should be more highly regulated than others?
I signed the ATR pledge, said I won't raise taxes, I won't vote for a single regulation. I think whenever we're doing that, raising taxes, raising regulations, we're pumping money out of the economy. We're not allowing businesses to grow. We're not allowing people to do what they're supposed to do, and that's create their own destiny. Government doesn't have anything. Government can't give you anything. They have to take it from someone else in order to do that. And we need to get government out of the way.
Laura Ingraham, speaking of the march and everything, Laura Ingraham got herself in a skirmish here at Fox because she tweeted out what I thought was a very mild criticism of this David Hogg.
Boy, yeah.
He had brought up his grades on another television network, and so she and was talking about how, whatever problems that was creating for him getting into college. As somebody who didn't get into all of my college choices, I thought, I don't really see the big deal here. This happens to a lot of folks. Nonetheless, this launched a call for a boycott of Laura's show, and some advertisers have left. Not to date all of us in this room, but I suspect we're all old enough to remember the Drop Dobbs campaign. I happened to be at CNN the night he left CNN because of a effort to get him off the air. Then there was the Drop Glenn Beck episode, and then there was the Stop Rush episode, which failed, thankfully. Then it has been Stop Sean Hannity and get him off the air. That has failed. And now they've switched to Laura. My question to you is, as a libertarian, everybody has a right to do what they want. If you don't want to watch Laura Ingraham, that's fine. But this turns into like a pressure campaign to take people off. What is your view as a Senate candidate? Is there anything senators can do about that? Because their objective clearly is to take off every conservative commentator on the air. Joe, you will be next at some point, I assure you. How do you deal with this?
Well, I don't think as a U.S. Senator I should be getting involved in who keeps their job and who doesn't. I don't want to go on a firing spree of someone that I shouldn't even be controlling. It's not my business. But with respect to boycotts, that's the ultimate goal of being a citizenry. With the free market, we should implement the free market more often and have boycotts so that we're getting people fired all over the place when they're not doing what we want to do. Those out there that want to control the Second Amendment, don't go after your legislators. Go after the pharmaceutical industry or the medical industry that isn't doing anything about this. Have boycotts on them. That's how we solve problems in the citizenry. But I don't think we should be getting involved in which news commentator gets fired and who doesn't. It's just, it's counterproductive.
Do you have a Twitter account?
I do.
Okay. You tweet as much as the president?
No, I haven't mastered the art of Twitter like him.
You know, the number one thing I hear from mainstream Republicans, that means people that have been doing business pretty much the same way forever, is that they should take that Twitter account away from the president. You think that's true?
What good is it going to do? I mean, he's someone that's going to say whatever he wants, wherever he wants, however he wants anyway. Taking a Twitter away from him doesn't really matter. Let him he has free speech, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
You know?
Exactly.
But
Exactly right. He's probably the most effective messenger that I've seen, certainly in our generation. I mean, he has the capacity to be able to generate messages that reach Americans everywhere. And so he's really been very effective in using Twitter and other forms of social media. Let me ask you a question about the same question I actually asked the other two, having to do with the school safety issue. You spoke very eloquently saying that members, elected officials ought to be principled people. I agree with that. They ought to be people who have principle and who stand by their principles and aren't afraid of what the media or anybody else says, that if you take a stand, you ought to stand there. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily address what we should do about the problem. We've had all these issues like the unfortunate kids in Parkland, Florida, and other places that have had people access their schools and shoot other kids. What do you think is a reasonable solution? We've had some that have suggested perhaps, and this would be a question that you would get in a fall debate, I'm sure, that have suggested maybe you should arm teachers, that teachers should be armed to protect themselves and protect their students. And then there are others that say, well, that's not really the route to go. So give us your sense of how you solve the problem.
sure. Well, first of all, like anything else, I think you should get to the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of the problem isn't the Second Amendment. The root cause of the problem isn't a gun jumping up and shooting someone. It's a crazy person. It's a criminal. So one of the things that I propose is that we make education local again. First of all, we get rid of the Department of Education, because that is but we kick it back to the states and to the communities, to the parent ultimately. That's where the choice should be on how you educate your kids, what's in your school, whether it's guns, whether it's a security system, whether it's pillows for a pillow fight. Whatever you want to do as a parent, you should be able to take your kids there, and they should feel safe, and you should feel safe. And we're not getting a good education system out of the Department of Education, so that's another issue in itself. But with respect to arming teachers, I'd like to change the narrative there a little bit. Not just arming teachers, arming qualified people, whether it's guards, police officers, teachers, janitors, whoever they might be. What happened to the right to carry a firearm, the right to bear arms? You have a permit to carry. What happened to that? These gun safe zones, they're not working. I don't feel safe when I go into a school or a post office or any of these facilities where you're not allowed to have a gun. I'd feel much safer knowing that armed people that are trained, that are well-versed in safety with respect to guns, out there carrying. I think that's the answer.
I just want to ask you a question about this. I happen to be a concealed carry permit person, and I have training in firearms, but in the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, anybody with a decent record can get a concealed carry permit. Do you think we ought to be required to have some of the training you talk about?
Article 1, Section 21 of the Pennsylvania Constitution says, shall not be questioned.
Easy enough. Easy enough.
Speaking of people carrying guns, should the president send the National Guard to the Mexican border?
I don't think that's going to be effective for a couple of reasons. One, they can't do anything when they get there. So it's not a fiscally responsible idea. I definitely understand his sentiment. He's not getting where he wants to with respect to the spending and the wall. And so I understand where he's going with it, but I don't think it's going to be effective in the long run. Just because they're handcuffed, they can't really do anything when they get there.
Right.
As a libertarian, where do you stand on foreign policy matters? I know that many libertarians kind of feel that the business of other countries is the business of other countries, but we do live in a global environment and we have a global economy. What is your sense of the appropriate posture of the U.S. with regards to other nations?
When I was growing up, Ronald Reagan was president, and that was the voice of conservatism to me, and which led me to a lot of my beliefs. And he said peace through strength, but he didn't say peace through endless wars. And that's what we have here today. We have endless wars with no end result. We don't even know where we're going. Many of our congressmen don't even know where we have soldiers around the world, which is a disaster. We should be declaring war through Congress, not through the executive branch. I don't care who's in office. We need to bring the war powers back to Congress. Let them declare war, have a plan, go in, support our troops, get out, and get the mission done and go home. And that's what we need to do. It's fiscally responsible and it's a constitutional way.
Let me ask you a second question. Should the president be talking with Kim, North Korea's dictator?
I think our president should definitely be diplomatic and talk with everybody. I said it from the beginning, back when he said he wouldn't talk to Kim. I said he should be talking to Kim. The guy's someone who's a leader in the world, whether you like him or not. He could influence war. There are a lot of things that he can do. I'm not saying to cater to the guy, but sit down and have a conversation with the guy. Make him feel like a man. You have to know people. And if you don't treat people like people, they're going to be your enemy forever. So sitting down, having a dialogue, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I greatly encourage it.
You mentioned President Reagan. His political soulmate was Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And she once said, she wrote at length about this, and this applies certainly to American politics as well as it did to British politics. She talked about what she called the socialist ratchet, and she explained it this way, in British terms, that if a Labour Party government gets elected, they move the government to the left. And then a conservative would get elected, and they'd more or less just sit there and manage it better. And then they'd run out of steam, and Labour would come back, and they'd move it further to the left, hence the socialist ratchet. And she said that she was going to make it her business, which she did, to move it in the other direction. If you're a sitting United States senator and you're in the Republican caucus and you're a libertarian like Rand Paul, how do you fight that?
Well, I think you mentioned something that is significant here. You're moving from the left to the right. How about we just do what's American? Have competition. Have more parties in there. Have people that are forcing people to the left, to the right, north, south. The earth isn't flat anymore, it's round. Let's treat it that way in politics as well. We just go out there and we elect someone because they have an R, a D, or red, or blue. Let's just listen to the ideas. And when you go to Washington, D.C., you have to be willing to work on all sides of the aisle, find the bills that you can win on, find the bills that you can't, and put them on the back burner, but never compromise your principles. And that's what you have to do, never compromise your principles.
So, you're a very positive guy. You're very well prepared. So when I say frustration, I ask, what is your biggest frustration as running as a libertarian? Are there any?
Sure, there are plenty of frustrations. One, the system isn't fair. We're set up as a two-party system. I have to get 5,000 signatures in order to be on the ballot, where the Democrats and Republicans only need 2,000. And that's not fair. It used to be 60,000, and in the last couple of years, we managed to get that down. That's why you see me here on the stage today, because we've been able to get over a lot of these hurdles. And that's why you're going to see us in debates more and in settings like this. What we need is to just treat everybody fairly. We need to have ballot access laws that everybody can just jump in and become a political party, or your political party can get on the ballot. There shouldn't be restrictions. And with respect to the primary system, I have to pay as a taxpayer for the primary election. But the Republicans and Democrats are only allowed to participate. I'm not. And that's not very fair. If I wanted to get on the ballot, I couldn't. In fact, I can't even turn in my signatures until August. And that's not very fair. So mainly, it's just around the two-party system and how we need to break that in order to break the establishment.
I think we can probably get one from each of you in.
Great. So tell me what you think. Obviously, elections, these campaigns are not inexpensive. You need money. Candidates need money in order to run a credible campaign for an office like the United States Senate. tell me what your philosophy is with regards to raising money and spending money for a campaign, and tell me what you think about the notion of campaign finance reform.
Well, I'll tackle that first part. You do need a lot of money to be able to run and to be able to win. At this point, I've done a decent job raising more than most libertarians have in the past. I've been traveling around the state, building my infrastructure and having a campaign team together. And actually, all my campaign members and workers, they're all volunteers. They're energetic, they love the campaign, they love the message. They're not paid to be there. So they're really excited about it. And that's what's great. I can go dish one of them off at an event, and they can go talk for me. They know the message just as well as I do. Some of them even better. Some of them are 17, 18, 19 years old. We're really getting the youth involved and getting them energized. And we're able to do this off less money. So we don't need millions upon millions of dollars. We can take it to social media. I'm getting out and knocking on doors. I'm going to events all over the place. I've done 4 state tours already. So that's how you win elections. It's with the people, because that's where it matters. That's where the solution is.
I'll ask a version of the same question I asked earlier. Protectionism. Do you see yourself as a protectionist, a free trader, a fair trader? I mean, where do you see yourself in that? What's the sort of libertarian take on this?
I'm a big fan of free trade. I mentioned earlier that someone that spoke to me was Reagan, and in 1980 he said, why are we talking about building these fences? Let's talk with people. Let's understand their problems, allow them to come in legally and figure out a way to gain citizenship and pay taxes and come and go as they please. And that always spoke to me, because Reagan was definitely a voice of reason when I was younger, and my grandfather really loved him, so that was just someone that I
That
was
makes me
related
feel
to.
good.
So I'm a free trade guy. If we install freedom in more of our scenarios, that's where the solution is. If this was Jeopardy, every answer is more freedom.
Do you think we need a border wall?
I'm sorry?
Do you think we need a border wall?
No, I don't think we need a border wall, because I think it's very ineffective to have a border wall. For one, people can climb over walls. People can tunnel underneath them. They can go around them. They can fly planes over top of them. I don't think the wall is going to be effective. And when you look at the narrative over the last few years, the problem for the wall, people say, well, we have an influx of people coming in over the border. Well, that was true for a while, but now it's trending the opposite way. So I don't think we need a wall to meet that solution. And we need to look at the policies. Why are people going the other way now? Well, at one time, it was around $15 or $12 to our $1 for Mexico to come over here and make a living. Now it's closer to 5 to 1. So they're not coming here as often now. We need to be more open, like Reagan said.
Libertarian candidate Dale Kearns.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.